Okay, we have the second part of what we were looking at in the previous lesson on slavery. The second part is going to focus on primary source analysis in particular. And I'm going to take you through a few activities that will help you make, hopefully help you make sense of how historians go about their work and how they use primary sources to come to certain conclusions. So as I move on to this next slide, you might want to just pause briefly and have the Fogel and Engerman chapter in front of you, but more importantly have the Stamp chapter on the screen, if you can download that PDF, because I'm going to make reference to some elements of Stamp as we run through this. Now, what I want to do here is obviously focus on slave testimonies more than anything else. So I want to kind of talk about how slaves themselves could express their experiences and work and within family and within all the things that I mentioned when we spoke about Fogel and Engerman, but from the slave perspective. And to be fair to Fogel and Engerman, as I mentioned, they were very interested in the agency of slaves. Just one of the kind of negative aspects of their work, however, was that they didn't really explore testimonies of slaves in any great detail. So listed below there are 5 categories of there are obviously more than this, but these are kind of 5 general broad categories of how historians have accessed information about slavery in the South before the Civil War. And I want to kind of focus on which ones might be the most effective in finding out the true nature of the so-called peculiar institution. So one of the first approaches that historians have kind of always used is to go to slave owners and to find research or find within their research what slave owners said about the nature of the slave system. And to find out such information, you have to go to any type of document that was created and written by slave owners. Now, there seems to be a fair amount of these available to historians across different states and archives, and these slave owner diaries, but not necessarily talking about personal diaries. We're really talking about diaries that kind of logged or documented what had to be done on a day-by-day basis on the plantation. And therefore the slave owner diaries are to some extent kind of like work instructions that might have to be handed over to the overseer on a plantation, so the overseer knew exactly what they had to do. So these slave owner diaries are really useful actually to kind of get a sense of things like the types of work that would be done on a plantation, what type of system would be used. Would it be the gang system, or would there be slaves that would have kind of individual skilled jobs, depending on also the size of the plantation and the nature of the crop that is being grown and produced. So these diaries are useful. Stamp uses them as well as Fogel and Engerman, and it's at this point that I want to just bring in a little bit of information from number 2 as well, where it says newspapers. So Stamp, if you have his book in front of you, you will see that there are footnotes, and these footnotes are really interesting to look at from the perspective of how historians produce their work, right? How they engage in research. So 1 and 2, slave owner diaries and newspapers, are something that you can see Stamp uses frequently, right? As well as letters written by slave owners to family members, or from slave owners to other slave owners. If you look at Stamp's work, right, and you look at page 141, which is chapter 4, to make them stand in fear. This is the main chapter that you will want to access if you write your essay on this topic. You'll see the footnotes 1 and 2 that there are letters that are written, and Stamp has therefore accessed these letters from the family papers of the Pettigrew family. And other information comes from judicial cases, so these are published documents that are available to historians. These judicial cases obviously relate to how maybe slaves had been treated. If you then flick over the next page to page 142, again focus on the footnotes, more reference to journal entries journal entries might be slightly different than kind of diaries that were for kind of instructions to be given on what to do on the plantation. Then you see another diary entry, and then more judicial cases, and then, this is why I pointed to number 2, newspapers. Stamp uses a lot of newspapers. He uses the Southern Cultivator from 1860, the Farmer's Register is another newspaper. If we go to page 114, there's another diary entry, and then page 145, more newspapers. Right, you kind of get the point. What we therefore get with Stamp and Fogler and Engelmann are historians that have very different interpretations of the nature of the slave system, but they kind of draw on the same sources to make their points and to come to their conclusions. Are these diaries and newspapers useful? Well, of course they are, or they wouldn't have been used by these historians. But they do tend to leave out something quite important, and that is the stories of slaves themselves. Now, we should have a little bit of sympathy for Stamp in this instance, and I want to kind of now touch on point 3 on the list. The reason I want to have a little bit of sympathy for Stamp is because as you go through his chapter, right, you will eventually get to a couple of examples where he does use slave testimonies from the period of the kind of 1840s. These are slave testimonies that were published at the time of slavery itself, right? So as you kind of flick through, right, eventually you'll end up on page 146, and you'll see at the top of the footnotes reference to Frederick Douglass. Now, Frederick Douglass, many of you will know, was probably the most famous black abolitionist of the pre-Civil War period, and Frederick Douglass therefore was someone who escaped from slavery, and in the process of doing so he then writes his account of being a slave. And this is useful because we get someone who had experienced slavery telling the story from their perspective. You're not getting the story of the slave owner. Now, it's important to remember that Douglass was obviously someone who loathed the way he was treated by his slave owner, which is perfectly understandable. But when he does write his book, My Bondage, he is an abolitionist, or he is taking an abolitionist approach. So now we also have to bear that in mind. This is not to say that Douglass is lying or exaggerating, but we should keep in mind that he has got a kind of political aim in his work, and that political aim is obviously the abolition of slavery. So keep that in mind. If you keep going through, again, these footnotes of Stamp, again, to give him credit, he does mention Douglass on a couple of occasions, but eventually you will get to the point, it's a little bit further on, right, actually it's quite late on, where he does make reference to Solomon Northrop, right? I think it's as far as another chapter that you have, but it's page 285. He referenced Solomon Northrop, who is another slave of the slave period, who writes his book, the famous biography of slavery, 12 Years a Slave, and the movie is obviously something that you will watch in preparation for your assessment. So these slave testimonies that Stamp uses are testimonies which I think are important. They're definitely important, but there might be a kind of abolitionist slant to both of them. Although, as you will see when you read Solomon Northrop, to be fair to Northrop, he is objective, and you'll notice examples of his objectivity in his slave testimony. So when we look at point 3 here, slave testimonies, the two that have been mentioned so far, Douglass and Northrop, are not actually part of the slave testimonies that were produced as a body of work in the 1930s, which I'm going to make reference to in a moment. They are both contemporary, so you could say that Douglass and Northrop's work are primary sources of the day. The slave testimonies are still primary sources, but they are written, in some cases, they are written, or the stories are told, 70 years after the end of slavery. One of or a number of actually the ex-slaves who tell the stories are into their hundreds. One woman, Mary Kinchin Edwards, is 127 when she gives her account of slavery to the WPA Writers Project in the 1930s. So keep that in mind. For the purposes of your assessment, it would be good if you did a little bit of additional research and you can access some of these slave testimonies from the WPA work online. But I'm actually going to get you to focus more on Solomon Northrop, somebody who wrote about his experience back in the 1840s. And as I say, I think there is a bit of objectivity in the work of Northrop, which we'll come to. Just a little bit of information there, therefore, on these WPA Federal Writers Projects. During the 1930s, during the period that we call the Great Depression, FDR's government, in an attempt to get people back to work, they create jobs, and one of the ways that they create jobs is just to come up with anything that will get people a small wage and get them off the unemployment statistics. So what was decided was that there should be some time spent trying to gather up the views and experiences of those who had lived so-called folk lives, right? A kind of return to folklore, and an attempt to kind of get a glimpse of a different way of life before industrialisation. And into this category fell ex-slaves. Now this was led by a white man who was kind of the main individual responsible for the WPA Writers Project, who was going to go and interview the slaves, ex-slaves, in the South. And most of the interviewers themselves were also white. There were some black, and it's interesting maybe to compare the outcomes of these interviews. Did white interviewers get a slightly different story back from black interviewers? I'll touch on that point in a second. But what I think is really interesting is these interviews take place in the 30s. They're not really released to the public until 1945, for obvious reasons, after the Second World War, right? So there had been other priorities. But even then in 1945, they don't become readily available. It's not even until the 1970s, I think 1970, when they were published in full. Now, Fogler Engelmann's book is written in 1974, so they really don't have as much of an excuse, right, for not focusing more on slaves themselves. Stamp has a bit more of an excuse. His book is written in 1956, so he doesn't really have access. Even though these testimonies have been given, right, they exist somewhere, they haven't really been collated, and therefore Stamp has more of an excuse as to why he does not necessarily include them within his work. He may have known about them, he may have decided to not have included them intentionally. One of the things I would say, and it's sort of fairly obvious potential weakness of these slave testimonies of 30s, is when ex-slaves in their 90s or their 100s start to recall slave life, there are a few problems, right? One is obviously age and time, and remembering fine details, remembering every aspect of slavery can be pretty difficult, right? And you may, as an elderly person, possibly only reflect nostalgically on some of the more positive aspects of your life, and you've shut out all the horrible and nasty aspects of slavery. The other issue is some of these people who were interviewed were actually quite young children, and therefore how much knowledge did they really have of the slave system? So we have to take that into account. And the point that I made earlier on was, did some of these ex-slaves in the 1930s maybe tell the white people who were interviewing them, you know, maybe the less kind of ugly parts of slave life? Maybe they decided to not burden this newer white generation with the kind of crimes of their forefathers, and maybe therefore did touch on, as I said, some of the more kind of positive things that they could recall from their life as a slave. But still, an excellent resource. Any slave testimonies, either from the period of slavery itself or from the 30s, are useful, and if a historian was to write obviously a history of slavery today, they would take into account all of these sources. So that tells us that the work of Fogler Engelmann, the work of Stamp, needs refined, it needs updated obviously, but they remain classic works. Number 4, slave notices. I'm going to talk about them in a moment. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of these in a moment. They're quite useful, they're objective, they are creations of the period prior to the Civil War, so when slavery still existed, and we can take quite a bit from them. And then the 5th example is what we call contemporary accounts. Now in the Stamp chapter he does make reference to Frederick Olmsted on page 148 footnote. Olmsted was a Swedish kind of explorer, and Olmsted and the kind of famous French writer who writes Democracy in America, a book about America's way of life and American politics. Alexis de Tocqueville. They do observe slavery and they give their views on slavery, but these are kind of interesting, but they're not particularly detailed. And because de Tocqueville and Olmsted don't quite know and understand the true nature of the system in the South, then you're not maybe getting the most kind of analytic interpretation of what is going on. But they both see slavery, and they obviously know that, you know, slavery is morally wrong in other parts of the world. So what we're going to do is focus on number 4 first of all, then we're going to talk a little bit about number 3 again. And I'm really just going to signpost you for number 3 in terms of what to do regarding Solomon Northrop's experiences and 12 Years a Slave. Okay, what do these sources contribute to the debates? And that is the debate that we're interested in, the debate about was slavery cruel and harsh, or was it benign and paternalistic? So there are sources that I've included embedded within this sway presentation. There are slave sale notices and there are runaway slave notices. I'm going to start with the slave sale notices. There were numerous examples of this. You can find these in museums, you can find them online, and they tell us quite a few interesting things about the nature of slavery. Now, we're going to start with one from 1852. This is in Savannah, Georgia. It's a sale of slaves who have been left as a result of the death of their owner, and for whatever reason nobody either is able to follow in the footsteps of the Luther McGowan and take up his plantation, or his children have no desire to carry on with this work. Although his children are obviously happy to take the money from selling slaves if that was the case. What you can see in this slave sale, right, which was public, humiliating, slaves put on podiums and they would be observed by those who would come along to decide if they wanted to buy a slave or not, and in the process, you know, would be inspected, prodded for people to see what type of quality of slave they were getting. In the movie 12 Years a Slave, you will see an example of a slave sale. This slave sale takes place fairly early on in the movie, and is one of the most horrific scenes in the movie, because what you see and what you can maybe get a sense of as you start to look at these slaves on this list is the separation of family members. Now, we don't know, right, from Luther McGowan's slave sale, from these slaves here, who is married, who has kids, but the very fact that we see young people on the list, not that many to be fair. There is a boy here that's 15, there's an infant child boy who is in the age of 1, there's a boy here at the age of 11. We kind of know, right, that there are some people here who will be the parents of those children. And we can also see some fairly elderly individuals. Bessie, 69, infirm, she can sew. Uncle Tim is able to work with horses. You know, you can see his price is reduced to go alongside his age. Is there any guarantee when someone comes to buy a slave at a slave sale that they're going to feel any sense of requirement to buy a parent, an elderly parent, along with the slave that they're buying, or the elderly parent and the child that belongs to the slave that they're buying? Not at all. In fact, if you look at the price of the infant, $400 is quite a lot of money for a 1-year-old. That's obviously an investment for the future, but it's not necessarily what slave owners were looking for. The prices of the slaves are coming in at just over $1,000. These are the slaves that are desirable. These are the prime slaves, the slaves that can pick rice, or the slaves that can pick cotton, and they are often in their 20s. This is when slaves are their most productive. And from this slave sale, we can therefore make lots of kind of good, hopefully, kind of points about the nature of the slave system. So from the type of work that is done, to the type of individuals who would carry out the work, so sometimes boys, sometimes girls. We can even see, right, if you look at age 19 Melly Ann, housework smart yellow girl, tells us that this girl, to use the phrase of the time, was yellow or mulatto, i.e. mixed race. Now what does that tell us? It might tell us that Luther McGowan could be the father of this child, or some other white man. So that tells us maybe a little bit about potential sexual exploitation of slaves as well. This is something that is also an issue in the 12 Years a Slave story, and it's, I think, played out really well in the movie. So something as simple as a notice for the general public to look at, I think gives you quite a lot of information. It's worth kind of looking at this in a bit more detail. Just one final point: if slaves are coming at over $1,000 on a number of occasions, it tells us that slavery is incredibly lucrative for southern slave plantation owners, and it tells us that if their institutional slavery is ever under threat by possibly abolitionists and northern politicians such as Abraham Lincoln. This is the next story we'll get to when we look at the causes of the Civil War. When the institution of slavery is threatened, then slave owners and the politicians who represent slave owners are going to fight tooth and nail to maintain this system, because they have got a lot to lose. A lot of financial capital is held in slaves. So, a really useful source for historians, because we can tell that the system is obviously cruel if it's willing to split up families, and we can see that slaves are often asked to do a whole range of different jobs. We don't know exactly how Luther McGowan's slaves were treated, but we can make assumptions. The next couple of sources both relate to runaway slaves. I'm going to spend most of the time on this one here. They are useful, these reward posters, because again they tell us that slaves are worth a lot of money. If a slave runs away, this is a little bit earlier, this is from 1838. If slaves run away, then owners want them back, right? This guy here, Henry May, who's a good cook, has run away, and we know that slaves who are skilled could be worth up to $1,000, maybe a little bit less in 1838. So we can see that by offering $150 if this guy is caught outside of Louisville, then that's a significant amount of money, and it's a reason why it was very difficult for slaves to run away, because there were posses and militias, slave catchers, who would do their best to make their money from finding these slaves who had run away. We don't know if Henry May is able to get to Cincinnati in Ohio and remain free, but he has escaped for a reason, and the reason that he's escaped, we can assume, is because he hates slavery. If the story that Fogler and Engelman tells us that slaves were pretty happy and pretty content, and made a good life for themselves and had decent conditions and could get married and had leisure opportunities, if all these things are true, then we might want to question if that is just too idyllic a picture that is painted, as Stamp himself has said, because slaves ran away, and slaves ran away for a reason. Now, I know we could argue, as we mentioned in the last lecture, that slaves didn't run away that often. Well, that's true, slaves didn't run away as often as you might think, but that's because they had nowhere to go, and it was very difficult to escape as far north as possible. So these again are quite useful primary sources, very objective primary sources, because they tell us that slaves were often unhappy, and usually males of a certain age were most likely to run away because they had the physical capabilities to do so. This next one, I just want to touch on this very quickly because I didn't mention this issue, I don't think in any great detail, whilst discussing the American Revolution. This is going back to the 18th century, this is an 18th century runaway, hence why the money is very different, £10. We're not dealing in dollars, this is still when slaves were part of the British Empire. But I thought it was worth pointing out the name of this slave, Crispus Attucks, most likely, who ran away from his master William Brown, and he makes it all the way to Boston, Crispus Attucks, where he becomes a seaman. He actually tries to catch whales, and he is a fairly well-known individual in Boston, and he is present on the night of the Boston Massacre as a kind of political agitator, part of this kind of newly emerging working class within Boston. And Crispus Attucks is someone who probably should be better known in American history. He's killed by British guns, by British soldiers, during the Boston Massacre. He's the first person who is shot, and therefore it could be argued that he is the first victim or martyr of the American Revolution. But he gets slightly less attention than John Adams and George Washington and Benjamin Franklin and so on and so forth. So these runaway slave notices can be traced back even to the pre-United States period and are useful. And that leaves us with the final example that I want to just very briefly talk about, and that is the movie that you're going to watch and the book that you're going to read, and the evidence within this book. Please don't cite the evidence from the movie, right? Because obviously the movie has been altered slightly for the purposes of Hollywood. So when you're quoting Solomon Northup, please quote the book. 12 Years a Slave is an excellent read. It's written in a really kind of straightforward way, and you get the story of Solomon Northup. Now, I'm not going to ask you to read the full book, right? You've got enough reading to be doing in terms of looking at the different historians, Stamp and Fogler and Ingeman, but you do need evidence in your essay to support the claims of Fogler and Ingeman, to support the claims of Stamp, and the general positions of Fogler and Ingeman and Stamp. So what you can see here is the book itself, and then what I've given you are questions that you can examine that will help you kind of tease out some of the points that will support Fogler and Ingeman, right? And I've wrote this in such a way to kind of assist you. Or is there evidence that will support Stamp? Watch the movie, then maybe go back to the book would be my advice. And I think you will get other little bits and pieces from Coltrane, little bits and pieces from Zinn as well. That will be useful. But the book is good because it highlights two different, and the movie does this also as well, two different types of slave owner, Master Ford and Master Epps. Ford is a fairly decent character, although he has his flaws, major flaw being that he's weak, and he's still willing to separate families, so bear that in mind, as much as he comes across as a nice guy in the movie. But he also comes across as a good guy in the book, because Solomon Northup is quite complimentary about him in the book, and that's something you might want to look out for. And then this other guy, Master Epps, is a complete sociopath, a horrible, horrible person, depicted in the movie in such a way, and also in the book. And Epps definitely fits the type of lunatic master plantation owner that would support Stamp's argument that slavery was cruel and harsh. So, quite a lot to be getting on with. The movie and reading Solomon Northup are your main priorities, which we'll talk about in a future kind of tutorial revision prior to the essay. But for now, that is all. Thank you.